Good evening. It is great to be back together for these events. Sheree and I were just discussing that this is our 6th year and approximately 12 events, and it's really nice to see old friends and some new. So I thank you for being here. I'm Brad Joya. I teach English, so tonight's program is a great program for me in particular. I was just looking at the book a little bit more, and I'm very pleased that you're here today. And we divide this program where I simply welcome everybody, and Sheree will now come up, and then we'll have some questions, and we have a special part of the evening at the end that I'll introduce. So I'll be back up here. But again, thanks for being here, and I'm very grateful to have worked with Sheree and the Trinity Forum. They do terrific programs. I wish I could get up to Washington frequently to hear speakers like the head of the NIH, but they're great about bringing wonderful speakers like you down here. So please join me in welcoming Sheree Harder back to the stage.
Thanks so much for that, Brad. On behalf of all of us at the Trinity Forum, it's a real pleasure to just keep this partnership going with you and with MBA and Jason, with you and St. Paul's. We're in our 6th year now, about to enter our 7th, and it's been just a real joy. So really appreciate you. We're also grateful to all of the sponsors who have made tonight's program possible. And I know many of you are here, so if you will indulge me in just recognizing you, that would be great. Our corporate sponsors, Sims Funk Law Firm and Gaw Properties, and we're delighted that Jeff and Julia Gaw has joined us tonight, along with Sam Funk and Scott Sims. In terms of our foundation sponsors, the Beasley Family Foundation, the Chairs Foundation with Joe and Judy Cook, and the Creed and Culture Fund of Byron and Beth Smith, and of course our friends and sponsors Lee and Mary Barfield, Gary and Susan Dean, Nathan and Laura Green, Ed and Molly Powell, and Giff and Anna Thornton. Thank you for all that you do to make this such an ongoing success. I also just want to recognize 2 trustees of the Trinity Forum that are here, Byron Smith, who all of you know, and our newest trustee, Sam Funk, Nashvilleian. We're really delighted to have him join the board, as well as to give a shout out to the students from New College Franklin who have joined us. If this is your very first Trinity Forum MBA St. Paul's event, a very special welcome to you. We're glad that you're here. We have almost a full house. We actually sold out a week ago, and I think perhaps the rain deterred a few people from coming tonight, but because we sold out, we will once again be live streaming as well as recording the event tonight. So if you had friends who wanted to make it tonight and were deterred for one reason or the other, fear not. They can log on to the MBA website right now and follow along via live stream, and they can also follow along via Twitter. We will be having comments added at hashtag Trinity Forum, hashtag TTF Tonight, and hashtag on reading if you want to add your own thoughts. So as Brad mentioned, over the past 6 years, we have tackled a wide variety of topics in these evening conversations. We started out with a look at Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural with historian Ron White. We looked with sociologist Oz Guinness as to whether freedom was sustainable and could endure. We, together with other speakers, we looked at we looked with Mako Fujimura on the arts and generativity. We heard from Rod Dreyer as to whether Dante can save your life. And of course, last November, many of you joined us when we heard from David Brooks on the role of character in public life. So with that diverse mix of topics, probably some of you, especially if this is your first time, are wondering what makes this all hang together, what coheres, and what is the purpose. So for our mission at the Trinity Forum is to try to provide a space and resources for leaders to engage the big questions of life in the context of faith. And we do this in many different ways. We do this in part by providing readings and publications which draw upon classic works of literature and letters that explore those enduring questions and connect the timeless wisdom of the humanities with timely issues of the day, as well as sponsoring programs such as the one tonight on a whole variety of issues that essentially connect leading thinkers with thinking leaders in engaging those big questions and coming to better know the author of the answers. And as we've noted at evening conversations such as this before, many of the big questions of life essentially boil down to just three. What is a good person? What is the good life? And what is the just society? And our speaker tonight, no stranger to challenge, will attempt to tackle all three. She'll discuss what it means to read well and the disciplines and the virtues that it both requires and calls forth in a person. She'll delve into the means of understanding and sustaining justice that reading both reveals and encourages. And she'll show how we can, in the subtitle of her own book, go about finding the good life through the great books. It is a tall order, but I am confident that there is no one who can tackle this topic with greater literary enthusiasm, wisdom, or insight as our speaker this evening, Dr. Karen Swallow Prior. Karen is a professor of English at Liberty University, where she has won multiple teaching awards. She also writes frequently on literature, culture, ethics, and ideas for The Atlantic, The Washington Post, First Things, Vox, Christianity Today, the Gospel Coalition, Books and Culture, and many other venues as well. In addition to her newest book, On Reading Well, Finding the Good Life Through the Great Books, which we've invited her to discuss here tonight, her earlier works also include Booked, Literature and the Soul of Me, and Fierce Convictions, The Extraordinary Life of Hannah More, poet, reformer, and abolitionist. She's a research fellow with the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission and a member of the Faith Advisory Council of the Humane Society of the United States, and I am very proud to say, a senior fellow of the Trinity Forum. Karen is also a woman of remarkable courage and fortitude. Literally, her last trip to Nashville, which was this spring, she was hit by a bus. Sustained massive injuries, including a fractured pelvis and collapsed lungs, and has made, as you can see, a remarkable recovery. And her first trip back to Nashville is with us here tonight. So with that, if you would give a warm welcome to Karen Swallow Prior.
It is so good to be here. Citizen Kane has his rosebud. For Charlie, of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, it's a golden ticket. And Winston Smith in George Orwell's 1984 has a beautiful glass paperweight containing a piece of pink coral. Each of these objects is, for their possessor, an emblem of their vision of the good life. Literature and real life are filled with such emblems that represent the attainment of our greatest longings. For Willy Loman in Arthur Miller's play, Death of a Salesman, it's a pair of green velvet slippers. Willy Loman leads the quintessential American life, characteristic of what Henry David Thoreau famously said when he wrote a century earlier, that the, quote, mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. Willie's case of desperation is cloaked in the glossy veneer of the American dream, beneath which, however, we find an empty, corrupted version of a once honorable ideal. When the play opens, Willie is dying. His memory is failing. He constantly tells his sons that the key to success in life is being well-liked. But as his appearances decline and his old contacts disappear, Willie's sales diminish and his failures increase until he is fired and his world crashes. The title of the work, Death of the Salesman, has a double meaning. The first refers to the end of the play, and spoiler alert, the salesman dies. The other is a passing reference in the play. It's a story within the story, like that pink coral inside the glass, a story of another salesman, Dave Singleman, whom Willie met years before when Dave was 84 years old. Dave, Willie tells us, would put on his green velvet slippers and pick up his phone and call the buyers, and without ever leaving his room, he made his living. Beholden to a vision for success that belonged to someone else, Willie decided that selling was the greatest career a man could want. What could be more satisfying, he asks. But when Dave Singelman died all those years ago, Willie says, he died, quote, the death of a salesman. In his green velvet slippers in the smoker of the New York, New Haven, and Hartford, going into Boston. When he died, hundreds of salesmen and buyers were at his funeral. For Willie, the velvet green slippers symbolize the attainment of his deepest longing, to be well liked. This is the desire formed in Willie's imagination, conscripted within him more and more deeply over time as he lives his life according to the habits and rituals of a corrupted American dream, one marked by shiny cars, new appliances, and, if you've read the play, you remember this, whipped cheese in a can. This false vision of the good life, which drives him for the rest of his life, ultimately drives him to his death. As the vision falters, and with it, Willie's own moral imagination, Willie emerges one day from one of his reveries into the past with the sudden realization that in his life, nothing's planted. He says, I don't have a thing in the ground. So he rushes off to get some seeds. His son Biff finds him later outside, late at night, planting the seeds. His action is emblematic. It's not literal seeds that Willie has neglected to plant, but seeds of enduring real values that he realizes only now that he has failed to implant in his sons. Before Willie's death, his son Biff accuses his father of so filling him with hot air while he was growing up, the hot air of unrealistic expectations and false illusions, that Biff never realizes the difference between a false vision and a true one until it is almost too late for Biff, too. Why did Willie's life as a salesman constitute the pursuit of a false dream? Because there's really nothing wrong with being a salesman. But the play shows it's because Willie has suppressed his true nature and sold himself out to become something he wasn't called to be. As we learn from various revelations in the play, it wasn't making sales that made Willie happy. It was making things with his hands. Reflecting upon Willie's self-inflicted death at the end of the play, his son Biff remarks, there were a lot of nice days when he'd come home from a trip, or on Sundays making the stoop, finishing the cellar, putting on the new porch, when he built the bedroom and put up the garage. There's more of him in that front stoop than in all the sales he made. After Willie's death, immediately following his funeral, Biff says of Willie, he had the wrong dreams, all wrong. He never knew who he was. The man didn't know who he was. And in not knowing who he was, Willie bought into a false vision of what it was he should become. Death of a Salesman is one of my favorite plays to teach to my students. The college students are in this liminal place. They are in a vulnerable position between dependence and independence, between adolescence and adulthood. They come to college thinking they are possessed of a vision of the good life. But more often than not, it is a vision they have merely received, not co-created. They do not know who they are. Who they think they are is usually a collage of fragments formed from parental expectations, peer influences, and more social media. But the work of their own moral imaginations through exposure to great ideas and great books helps them, as it can help us, to achieve the knowledge vital to casting a vision for the good life that has been fitted for each of us by our Creator. My literary and spiritual memoir, my first book, Booked Literature and the Soul of Me, examines the way visions of the good life were implanted in me by great books. From Great Expectations, one of my favorites, I learned the power the stories we tell ourselves have to do either harm or good to ourselves and to others. From Madame Bovary, I learned to embrace the real world rather than escaping into unsustainable and unrealistic romanticism. From Gulliver's Travels, I learned the profound limitations of my own finite perspective. From Tess of the D'Urbervilles, I saw the power of grace and the tragedy of its absence. And from the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, I came to love the pied beauty of the world and of me because of the one who created those. But these aren't merely intellectual or moral lessons, although they certainly may begin as such. Rather, the stories and images from these books and so many others show us the practices that lead toward or away from the good life. Virtues, according to Aristotle, are the moderation or the mean between the vices of excess and deficiency. They manifest within us, within the context of a given situation, a practiced response to whatever great good or ill a life or day, an hour, a moment, and it can only take a moment, I know that, might bring. The good life, therefore, does not depend on the absence of suffering, pain, ill, or wrong, but is the constant practice of making up for loss, not with excess, but with the grateful mean that restores balance and harmony. Virtue is acquired through both knowledge and practice. Practices are the patterns we put ourselves through every day, every year, through a lifetime. As James K.A. Smith has shown in his book, Desiring the Kingdom, and his other book, Imagining the Kingdom, practices become habits, habits become virtues, and ultimately virtues become who we are and what we love. In Imagining the Kingdom, Smith explains that imagination is fundamentally aesthetic in nature. As human beings' meaning-making faculty, imagination is the force that presses us, making impressions on us and in us. Being made in the image of God, the process of imaging or imagining is a simultaneous and reciprocal receiving and sending forth. Imagination is both mimetic, imitative, and generative, creative. Without imagination, we are mere animals, worms living out our days in the dark. Good books tap into the powers of imagination to allow us to picture the possibilities, both bright and dark, for human existence, possibilities we might not otherwise know. Literature makes concrete, it embodies and incarnates the abstractions of ideas and ideals. The world's literary masterpieces provide a classroom for formation. In holding forth visions of the good life, great literature cultivates desire for that good life. Furthermore, reading such literature is a practice that cultivates virtue as the reader inhabits the world of the book and exercises vicariously the choices and actions embedded in that world. As C.S. Lewis famously observed, and you probably know this quote, "We are half-hearted creatures fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered to us, like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased." In other words, we cannot desire what we cannot imagine, and we cannot imagine what we have not seen. But the human imagination is more than just a picture-making function. Language is inextricably bound to the working of the imagination. Imagination is, after all, the expression of the Creator showing forth his image in the creation. To imagine is to mirror God, the Word, in us. Imagination is the bridge between word and world. Through imagination, a mere picture becomes an idea expressed in words, which then becomes a way of being and acting in the world. And while human nature is unchanging, the world we live in and the sense we must endeavor to make of it is always shifting. In an important essay by Graham Ward in the Oxford Journal Literature and Theology, titled "How Literature Resists Secularity," Ward states, quote, "Human beings do not just live in the world, they produce it. He explains that the human ability to imagine goes beyond mere mimesis or mimicking when it starts to create and to fashion. Books change us, Ward explains, because reading is one of the various practices that form, transform, and refigure subjectivities and knowledges of self and world, informing the soul and writing upon the body. Ward proclaims, in defiance of every fashionable post-structuralist, deconstructive, politically correct, and utterly desacralized view of literature that now reigns in the academy, quote, "There are books that have changed people's lives," end quote. And to this, I also offer witness. But in recent decades, as the concept of the good life has fallen away, for who can define what is good anyway, so too has the idea of great books, for who is to judge what constitutes greatness? And this being the case, why study literature at all? Well, I answer, because it is not just what great books teach us that leads us to the good life, it's how they tell us. For example, as we read in Pride and Prejudice about Elizabeth Bennet, we also read with her. As we see through her eyes her first impressions of Mr. Darcy and Mr. Wickham, and that was Austen's first title for Pride and Prejudice, First Impressions, we misread, along with Elizabeth, her reading of the character of Mr. Darcy. We are duped into trusting Elizabeth's perspective because it seems to us and to her so eminently trustworthy. Admiring, as we should, her keen insight, sharp wit, and self-assurance, we take pride in our judgment, as Elizabeth does in hers, only to find that very pride that comes before a fall. Recoiling with her at Mr. Darcy's unmistakable pride, we turn out to be prejudiced. Reading this book is an act of meta-reading. It is reading about misreading, and a lesson in hermeneutical humility, as is all literary reading. This is why the way we read can be even more important than what we read. The most literary of literary reading is, of course, poetry, the kind that most of us probably read the least of. As the form of literature that uses language in the most condensed fashion, poetry magnifies the power of all literary art to break down the walls of our prison house of self. Poetry binds likeness to likeness, word to music, image to sensation, while the rest of the world divides and derides, pushes away and pushes apart, confronts and affronts. Poetry brings together. While the world spots differences, poetry seeks semblances. It is, one might say, even a ministry of reconciliation, a ministry of weaving a fractured, fallen world back together, word by word, of gathering up scattered pieces of brokenness and gluing them back together again, like a cracked china cup in which meaning is served to overflowing. Consider, for example, the astonishing insights of this poem by Walt Whitman, which compares the human soul in a state of existential and spiritual angst wrought by the modern condition to, of all things, a spider. So bear with me, I'll read this short poem. A noiseless, patient spider. I marked where on a little promontory it stood, isolated, marked how to explore the vacant, vast surrounding. It launched forth filament, filament, filament out of itself, ever unreeling them, ever tirelessly speeding them. And you, O my soul, where you stand, surrounded, detached in measureless oceans of space, ceaselessly musing, venturing, throwing, seeking the spheres to connect them, till the bridge you will need be formed, till the ductile anchor hold, till the gossamer thread you fling catch somewhere, O my soul. Now there's far more to say about this poem than I can manage here tonight, But what is most notable is how the language of the poem does what poetry is designed, and all literary works are designed to do, to make connections. The poem brilliantly parallels the self-made filament of the spider, that creature's tenuous connection to the world, and the musing, venturing, throwing, and seeking of the modern soul, unmoored from traditional truth and authority, merely a gossamer thread to fling ceaselessly until it finds something to hold. The language of poetry and song, of rhyme and verse, comes naturally to us, as anyone who has a small child knows. But unlike spoken language, reading does not come naturally to human beings. It must be taught. It must be practiced. Because it goes beyond mere biology, there is something profoundly spiritual about the human ability and the impulse to read. In fact, the various senses in which we use the word captures this. To read means not only to decipher a given and learned set of symbols in a mechanistic way, but it also suggests the very human act of finding meaning, of interpreting in the sense of reading a person or situation. To read in this sense might be considered one of the most spiritual of all human activities, inasmuch as it allows us to transcend the immediacy of the material and of the moment at hand. Through imagination, great books allow us to behold characters, places, situations, and ideas far beyond where our bodies can take us. In this way, great books expand our communities and thereby expand the possibilities of our visions for the good life. Thus, reading literary writing, that is, writing that uses language artistically so that it both teaches and delights, has a socializing or humanizing effect on us. In fact, more and more studies confirm that emotional intelligence, empathy, and social perception are measurably improved after test subjects read literary fiction in particular. Researchers attribute this outcome to the role the imagination plays in reading literary works. Reading requires our minds to make inferences, interpret nuanced indicators, gauge emotions, and predict outcomes, just as we must do in real life every day. In emphasizing showing rather than telling, literary texts require readers to do more interpretive work in discerning the meaning of a story, and such activity recreates the interpretive work we do as we interact with people in real life, reading them and with situations that we encounter every day, all day long. Furthermore, studies in neuroscience, psychology, and cognitive science show that deep reading, slow, immersive, rich in sensory detail and emotional and moral complexity, that kind of reading, is a distinctive experience, a kind of reading that differs in kind and quality from the mere decoding of words, which constitutes a good deal of the reading we do today on social media and blog posts and anything in this digital age. Literary critic Frank Kermode distinguishes between what he calls carnal reading, characterized by the hurried utilitarian information processing that constitutes the bulk of our daily reading diet, and spiritual reading, reading done with focused attention for pleasure, reflection, analysis, and growth. Great books then expand our imagination not only by enlarging our field of vision beyond the limits of our finite experience, but also in helping us to practice finding and making meaning. Stories take place in linear time and thus imitate our sense of our earthly existence, which also has a beginning, middle, and end. Even stories that play with linear time actually do so while rooted in it. And the heart of every story is conflict. Without a conflict and the events that lead and follow it, there is no story, but merely a series of events. This center of the story is the very phenomenon that requires or creates our need to make meaning out of our lives. For conflict lies at the heart of the ultimate story of human existence: creation, fall, and redemption. Stories embody this truth in a way that parallels the incarnation. Because literature embodies the linearity and connectivity of our conflict-ridden lives, reading is practice in making meaning out of the very human condition. Metaphorically, stories, drama, and poetry put flesh on ideas so they can dwell among us. So perhaps the best vision for the good life begins with the knowledge of death, with the knowledge of the inevitability of death and the limit of our mortal frame and earthly existence. To know that we will surely die can guide us in knowing how to live. And there may be no book more fit to explore this than Leo Tolstoy's short novel or long short story or parable, The Death of Ivan Ilyich. The story begins with the announcement of Ivan Ilyich's death at age 45. But the family and colleagues who soon gather do not see death in this death. Rather, they see only how their lives are affected by the event, their inconveniences, their anticipated advancements, their unwanted social obligations. Indeed, the story says, each one thought or felt, well, he's dead, but I'm alive. So too had been Ivan's blindness, as we learn from the first sentence of the second chapter, which says, Ivan Ilyich's life had been most simple and most ordinary, and therefore most terrible. The narrator then takes us through his life, his schooling, his career success, his marriage, fatherhood, all carried out according to the routine of secular rituals, in accordance to a received vision of how a successful life should go, one, quote, easily, pleasantly, and decorously lived. And it is while decorating that Ivan Ilyich suffers his literal and metaphorical fall. In a sumptuous new home arrived at in consequence of one more career advancement, Ivan becomes seized suddenly by the task of adorning the place. While hanging new drapery, he slips and falls, bruising his side. Weeks and months pass. One symptom leads to another. The doctors are unable to arrive at a diagnosis. Pain takes over, and Ivan's ability to take pleasure in the life he has worked so hard to achieve diminishes. In response to his illness, his wife and daughter muster only feelings of annoyance. And in the face of his family's indifference, Ivan begins to feel hatred. His physical pain increases, as too his spiritual and emotional anguish, that nothing he has achieved in this life seems to mean anything. As his condition worsens, he discovers, quite accidentally, that his pain, his physical pain, is alleviated when his servant holds up his legs. This common peasant, Gerasim, is the only kind, compassionate person in Ivan's life, and in his death, it turns out. As his death draws near, Ivan's torments increase. Opium helps some of his physical suffering, but there seems to be no relief from his spiritual anguish. One night he cries out in anger to the God he had ignored his whole life. Why hast thou done all this? Why hast thou brought me here? Why dost thou torment me so terribly? And in imagination, he began to recall the best moments of his pleasant life. But strange to say, none of those best moments of his pleasant life now seemed at all what they had then seemed. He thinks, it is as if I had been going downhill when I imagined I was going up. And that is really what it was. I was going up in public opinion, but to the same extent life was ebbing away from me. And now all is done, and there is only death. One night, gazing into Gerasim's face, Ivan Ilyich suddenly wonders, what if my whole life has been wrong? In facing this question, his mental sufferings become even worse than his physical pain. For the last 3 days of his life, Ivan screams. In the midst of it, 2 hours before his death, he finally asks himself, but what is the right thing? And upon asking this question, he felt that someone was kissing his hand. He opened his eyes, looked at his son, and felt sorry for him. His wife came up to him, and he glanced at her. She was gazing at him open-mouthed, with undried tears on her nose and cheek, and a despairing look on her face. And he felt sorry for her too. And suddenly it grew clear to him that what had been oppressing him and would not leave him was all dropping away at once from 2 sides, from 10 sides, from all sides. He was sorry for them. He must act so as not to hurt them, release them, and free himself from these sufferings. How good and how simple, he thought. And the pain, he asked himself, what has become of it? Where are you, pain? He turned his attention to it. Ah, yes, here it is. Well, what of it? Let the pain be. And death, where is it? He sought his former accustomed fear of death and did not find it. Where is it? What death? There was no fear because there was no death. In place of death, there was light. So that's what it is, he suddenly exclaimed. What joy! To him, all this happened in a single instant, and the meaning of that instant did not change. For those present, his agony continued for another 2 hours. Something rattled in his throat. His emaciated body twitched. Then the gasping and rattle became less and less frequent. It is finished, said someone near him. He heard these words and repeated them in his soul. Death is finished, he said to himself. It is no more. He drew in a breath, stopped in the midst of a sigh, stretched out, and died. These are the last words of the story. In death, Ivan Ilyich finds his vision for the good life. Indeed, he finds life itself. Death will come for all of us, and when he does, he will not be a stranger. Death is the shadow that has trailed us all our days, come round to meet us at the front door, and no lock can keep him out forever. How we die will depend on how we live, as the death of Ivan Ilyich and so many works of great literature show. For those of us who profess Christ, the vision that shapes our habits, practices, and virtues in pursuit of the good life is not a rosebud stamped on a sled, or a golden ticket to a factory of delights, or a pair of green velvet slippers. It is one that more closely resembles the image of the servant who, by tending the feet of others, bears their suffering. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Pryor. I'm sure there are a lot of questions, a lot of thoughts there. We could probably all pause for a minute and just reflect on a lot that we heard. And when you were speaking, you spoke about C.S. Lewis and the notion of the mud pies, and we're content with the mud pies instead of a holiday at the sea, and then the research about carnal reading versus spiritual reading. And I think if we all reflect honestly, that carnal reading is calling at us on our iPads, on our phones, and it's a struggle to pause and to benefit from the good books, as you've spoken. Maybe not for a college student because they have to do it, but many of us in this room, we probably have a choice tonight. Once we get home and it gets quiet, what are we going to do with those few minutes between this evening and going to sleep? And there's not a great book on my nightstand right now. There's an iPad. So I just wonder, in your work with college students and others, how you see opportunity for the digital age to not drive us all to the carnal, but also to the spiritual reading, and where maybe if you've seen any examples of where there's actually a way to make a connection more deeply that way. And so that's my question. And then as Dr. Pryor answers that, I invite anyone to come forward and wait at the microphones, and after she answers that one, please share any questions that you have this evening. Thank you.
Well, that was a tough question. Yeah, how do we cultivate the habit of reading well, of spiritual reading? I think the first thing, we just simply have to acknowledge, if we haven't already, that it's not something we can take for granted. I grew up having the love of reading instilled in me, as previous generations did. But now we have so many other things to distract us. We have to be intentional and purposeful, I think, in our own lives to set those things aside. And even if we just say it's 10 or 20 or 30 minutes a day of undistracted reading of some great work, that's a start. And as teachers, I think we also have to know that our students have so many other temptations, and so we have to train them to be disciplined. We have to show them the benefits and rewards of reading. I've changed some of my teaching practices to just spend more time in the classroom doing close reading of passages, because I know many of them are skimming to just sit and dwell and reflect on a passage or a sentence or a phrase, and to practice that with my students, because we are not naturally virtuous, and we have to practice being virtuous, and more, reading is a virtue we're losing, and we have to be intentional and practice it. There aren't any quick solutions, but I think recognizing the need, to invoke the cliche is half the battle.
I was fascinated with some of the books that you chose to speak out of to us tonight. I'm curious as to 3 or 4 more works for you that have been, as you see, both mimetic and generative.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I would say the book that has been the most of those things for me is Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. And, if you've not, I want to say it's not as girly a book as a lot of people think it is. So, men, if you haven't read it, read it. Jane Eyre embodies really what the novel is. It's the genre of the modern condition in which we all have to sort of, we don't have an inherited sense of self. We aren't going to be something just because we were born to parents who were that thing. We have to figure out who we are amidst competing and alluring voices that would take us away from what we're called to be. And so Jane Eyre really is the journey of that modern self, resisting the temptations to be someone else other than who she's called to be, which is also what Willy Loman didn't do successfully. So Jane Eyre would be one. I mentioned Madame Bovary, which probably was another most influential book in my life. Great Expectations, I think I mentioned also, is a great favorite. I like British literature. Did that? Yeah. Okay. World literature. Yes. Yeah. And let's see. Let me find one more. One more that I write about in book, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which again I mentioned. It is a classic Aristotelian tragedy, and Hardy is famous, as one critic put it, for being angry at the God who doesn't exist. And I think that's a compelling idea. All of his novels and even his poetry are kind of grappling with that sense of the loss of faith that he experienced personally and that his times in the Victorian age experienced. And so I think even though that's an older 19th century book, there's a lot about our condition today that that book and his other books speak to. By the way, it's very dark and tragic, as all of his works are, and I do have a taste for that. So, sorry. Thank you.
Hi, Karen. Thank you for
Hello.
your talk. I have a question for maybe some advice. I also was raised with a love of reading and was put on reading restriction as a kid because it was the only way to get me to do anything else.
Oh, wow.
How do you encourage people to read, not students, as adults, who don't feel like they have the time, or maybe they haven't learned that virtue at an age where it was easier to learn it, and now it's like, it does seem hard, especially to tackle the great literature, it's long. I feel like I'm at this point in my life where I feel like, if people just read books, more things would be solved. But I think Anna Karenina just because I tell them to. So I wonder if you had any advice, like how would you give that to your contemporaries or other people who may not have the habit of reading, but should gain it?
No, that's a good question. I think those of us who grew up reading, we think of reading as an isolated individual activity. But there is a power in social media, and there are book clubs online and ways to encourage reading in community, I think is very powerful. And there are many great works that are shorter. whether it's poetry or I mentioned, The Death of Ivan Ilyich is a short novel. I cover a couple of short stories on Reading Well. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be a month's or year-long commitment. We can read shorter pieces, talk about them with people, whether in person or online. And there are books out there about doing this in church communities as well, just reading secular good literature as part of a spiritual practice because of the virtues it cultivates. So there are so many things that I think we can do besides my old-fashioned way of just like sitting in a book by myself and reading all day and not talking to anyone. I love that. But there are other ways to read together and form that habit together. So, book clubs, yay.
Thank you. That was very inspiring. I don't know if this makes sense, but it's a genuine question. When you spoke about conflict being a part of the heart of human existence, and that's why we find stories so appealing, and there's so much hope we can gain from them, I was wondering, it wasn't necessary that conflict be part of our experience, and one day maybe it won't be. So I was wondering if a different way of being would necessitate a different kind of reading, and if that's a taste that we could offer our students and ourselves.
Good question. I actually think about this question a lot because I've sometimes said that art is a result of the fall, but then you have Adam who speaks the first poetry when he sees Eve, and that was before the fall. And so I think just being made in the image of God he's a creator, we are a creator. We don't know what it would be like to create out of something that's not conflict. So I think it's something that I can't imagine. Well, it's just because we're still making the mud pies. So I think that what you're saying is right. That is what it will be. We will be creative in that sense without conflict. But I have no idea what that will be like. But it will be. Thank you.
Last question.
Thank you. I'd like to frame this question in the context of storytelling and not just novels, if I may, because in the context of American contemporary culture, so influenced by Disney, and I'm just wondering if you believe that art can be great without a happy ending in light of the Disney-esque mandatory happy ending. Real life doesn't always have a happy ending, and I just wondering if you could comment on that.
I mean, as I said, I do have a taste for the tragic and dark, and I do think that, I think happy endings are fine, but I actually think the unhappy and tragic endings probably have more to teach us about living in life. But we need both. I mean, in the classical tradition, there was tragedy and comedy, and they were just kind of polar opposites, and both balanced each other out. And so that's what virtue is, a balance of tensions. So I think we do need both. And in drama, we have, the happy mask and the sad mask. So I think we need both in order to have a full vision of what the human condition is. But So again, if our children are being immersed in the world of Disney, then we need to balance that out with, where the red fern grows. I don't know. So we need balance in every respect, even in our reading. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Karen. Karen's book on Reading Well will be available for sale and for signing right outside. We highly recommend it to you. It's really, I have read it. It is a delightful as well as deeply compelling book. In addition to recommending her book, we want to make another recommendation, and that is for an invitation that should be on each of your chairs to join the Trinity Forum Society. So against a culture that is marked by distraction in our personal lives, the alienation, division, and frankly crazy rhetoric that marks our public discourse, the sensationalism and triviality of our entertainment culture, we try to provide a place for leaders to consider together first principles, the big questions of life, in a way that is both intellectually rigorous and provocative, as well as warmly hospitable. A show, not just a tell, of a counterculture way of relating in this world. And we encourage you to be part of the society that helps make events such as tonight possible. There are, of course, different benefits to joining the Trinity Forum Society as well. Chief among them for tonight, the first 5 people who join the Trinity Forum Society will receive a free and signed copy of Karen's book. So avoid the line, join the Trinity Forum Society. In addition to that, we also provide quarterly readings. There was a question earlier about what do we do when there's only really large, great books. The answer is Trinity Forum readings, which take the best of literature and letters, provide helpful excerpts, provide an introduction that provides context, background, talks about significance, and discussion questions in the back so that it is essentially a book club in a bag. So in addition to quarterly readings, you also have monthly podcasts with different thought leaders such as Dr. Pryor, as well as our daily list of recommended readings that we circulate entitled What We're Reading. So if you are interested in joining the Trinity Forum Society, please see me, see Byron Smith, or see my able colleagues Colleen O'Malley and Alyssa Abraham. If you could just stand up and wave your hand so people can identify you. They will be in the back and would be very happy to take your membership. And of course, if you are interested in helping to sponsor other programs such as tonight, please talk to me, talk to Colleen, talk to Byron Smith. We would love to have you be part of the sponsorship committee that makes these events possible. As we wrap up, it is appropriate to end with thanks because there are many people who make an event like tonight possible who are not up here in the front. So I want to thank again our sponsors who helped to underwrite this evening. Thanks again to our partners, Brad Joya, MBA, and Jason Powell at St. Paul's Academy. The people in the background who helped make this happen, the staff at St. Paul's and MBA, with particular thanks to Kristen Jones and Ashley Larmer from St. Paul's and Langan Coleman from MBA. Our photographers, John Morgan and Kristen Stewart, videographer Barry McAllister. Volunteers, our former intern, our intern emeritus, Nathan Tolles, who joined us for the evening. Kate Kemp and Anna Regnier, who are juniors at St. Cecilia, Tracy Wilson, and Tim Crowbeth. So glad to have you all here. I want to also thank my terrific colleagues, Nashvillian and newlywed, Alyssa Abraham Crowbeth, who's here, Colleen O'Malley, Colleen O'Malley Horrocks, another newlywed. It's been a busy time at the Trinity Forum. So thank you so much for your work in making tonight possible. Before we wrap up, we actually have a special presentation from MBA that Brad is going to introduce.
Some of the people here tonight know that one of our teachers, Robert Sawyer, who graduated actually from MBA in 1998 and then came here to teach in 2002, ends his class each year by affording his students a perspective about how literature offers certain truths and understandings of who we are as human beings. And I think it's very much in line with your talk tonight, and so we thought this would be a wonderful way to finish the evening. I'm very proud to offer or to introduce you to my former student and now colleague, Robert Sawyer. Please welcome Robert.
Thank you, Brad. A little context. In the 7th grade English class at MBA, we study Greek mythology. We've read the Wright brothers. We read A Christmas Carol, The Hobbit, Fahrenheit 451, short stories, and To Kill a Mockingbird, and you will hear several of those referenced. It will not be hard for you to imagine being a 7th grade boy, squirming and excited to leave at the end of the year. You may be feeling similar thoughts now. Gentlemen, congratulations on finishing the year. We've had a good year, and I'm proud of you. I want us to keep this year in perspective. This will not be the highlight of your life. You have bigger and better things ahead of you. But I hope that many of the things that we've done this year, even if you don't remember them 5 or 10 or 15 years from now, will have become a part of you. I hope that you'll be strong like Hercules and wise like Athena. I hope you'll be like Perseus and take on seemingly impossible tasks. I hope you'll be like Theseus, and you'll choose the difficult but rewarding path instead of just the easy one. I hope you'll be like Jason, and you'll learn not to sacrifice everything for a golden fleece. I hope you'll be like Odysseus. You'll yearn for your family and your home. Or like Prometheus, that you'll be willing to sacrifice yourself to serve others. I hope you'll be like Wilbur and Orville Wright. You'll try new things, you'll risk failure, and you'll fly high. I hope you'll be like Sherlock Holmes. You'll use your abilities to help others. Or like P.S. Wilkinson, you'll learn the value of personal honor. From Fahrenheit 451, I hope you'll be like Clarice McClellan. You'll love nature and be independent. That you'll love to read like Faber. That you'll help people like Granger. That you'll be willing to stand up against a corrupt society like Guy Montag. I hope you'll be like Bob Cratchit. You'll work hard and love your family. I hope you'll be like Ebenezer Scrooge, and when you realize you're wrong, you'll be willing to change. And like Scrooge, I hope you'll find great joy in life. I hope you'll be like Gandalf the Wizard from The Hobbit. You'll see the best side of people. Or like Thorin Oakenshield, you'll be tough and focused and disciplined, and you'll stick to your goals. I hope you'll be like Bilbo Baggins. You'll remain courageous even when you're terrified. And as Thorin said about Bilbo, you'll love food and home and cheer more than treasured gold. From To Kill a Mockingbird, I hope you'll be like Scout Finch, and you'll learn from your mentors. Or Dill Harris, and you'll empathize with others. I hope you'll be like Miss Maudie Atkinson, and you'll remain optimistic in tragedy. Or like Mr. Walter Cunningham, you'll remain honorable even in tough times. I hope you'll be like Jim Finch, and you'll learn the true value of courage. As Atticus told him, it's not a man with a gun in his hand, but it's when you know you were licked before you begin, but you begin anyway. You see it through to the end. You rarely win, but sometimes you do. I hope you'll be like Atticus Finch. You'll do what's right, even when everyone you know hates you for it. And then you'll be gracious enough to forgive them for hating you for it. I hope you'll fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run. Then yours will be the earth and everything that's in it. And which is more, you'll be a man, my son. Thank you. Class dismissed. Class dismissed. I believe that's the end of the evening.